Welcome to Pizza Quest. I'm Peter Reinhardt, and we're going to be with an old friend of mine today. My guest is Joel Kostman. We go back a long way. We're going to talk about that. But he's been on his own quest, a lifelong quest. First as a musician and a songwriter, and then as an author, 28 years ago of a cult classic, all this time earning a living as a New York City locksmith. Here's what the liner notes of his book says. The book's called Keys to the City. Joel Kostman is a beeper-bound, licensed knight of the vice grips, the pick set, the hole saw, on call. He's also a master storyteller whose job provides him with all the material he needs. He arrives on the scene, and in no time, he's heard about childhoods and children, lovers and fears. He's repaired a lock for 5 guys dining naked in a steamy apartment on a sub-zero night. He's changed the cylinder for Bugsy Siegel's personal physician. He's worn, for a minute, a jacket and tie of Eddie Cantor's after rescuing the entertainer's 92-year-old cousin who's lost his keys but kept the wardrobe for decades. Thank God, the old man cries when he sees his savior on the stairs. You will let me in. The New York Times calls Joel Kostman the doctor of the Deadbolt and quotes him, "New Yorkers are concerned about keeping people out on a very primal level, whether it's an abusive spouse or a creep on the corner. They like to talk. I like to listen." This funny and touching book is the result, and as Joel's letting the locked out into their cars and apartments, they are letting him into their lives. These are their stories. Ordinary people, star performances. Hey, Joel, welcome to Pizza Quest. We've got a lot of catching up to do here, but first, based on what I just read, this book sounds like a perfect setup for a TV show or a film. What do you think?
I'd love it. I would love it. It's been, it's been looked at and optioned over again for 24 years, I believe. Um, and they keep threatening to do it. They just haven't done it yet. With
Well, it seems like such a natural. We thought it was going to happen as soon as you let us know that the option came in, and but this is the real story now. I think the real story, and it could be the big book is the journey to get this book, which had its own cult following. I remember you used to be interviewed on NPR, and
Yeah.
did signings at some great bookstores and everything. And the journey to become, how does a book actually make it to a different platform like that?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I wrote it, first of all, I never thought it was going to be a book. I mean, I was in a writing group, and and I had been working on fiction for years that never quite made it. Came close, but never quite made it. And I'm still locksmithing, and I just sort of ran out of energy. And a friend of mine who was a published writer, who actually just passed away, famous in France, talked to an old buddy of mine from college, talked me into writing the lock stories. He said, "Do them just like you tell them at parties." He said, "But do it true to yourself, true to your literary self. Don't make them little puff pieces." And I went, "What the hell are you talking about?" But I tried it, and it took me a while. Find the voice, did it, and I was in this writing group, and the husband of one of the people in the writing group was a pretty top literary agent. And I read one of the stories one night, and he said, "What are you gonna do with that?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. If I write a bunch of them, don't I have a book?" And the guy said, "A book?" So he almost knocked me off the rails, but
I thought he was going to say yes, and let me represent you.
exactly. I was ready to jump. So it took me about a year and a half, put the thing together, kept rewriting the stories, and gave it to the agent of my friend. And she called me the next day and said, "I want to try to sell it for you." And she sold it like, in minutes. So it got optioned about a year later. I think that was 24 years ago. And the same guys who were working on it 24 years ago are involved in the project
They haven't given up yet.
as we speak. One guy in particular has not given up yet, and it's come very close. HBO had it 12 years ago. Rumor had it that James Gandolfini read my book and was going to be the locksmith, on a new show, which I never believed, but they all tell me it's true.
He would have played you. James Gandolfini was going to play you.
James Gandolfini was going to be me, and then he dropped dead of a heart attack in Italy. Um, and you know, I just don't know. I really don't know. I've heard rumors from all the folks who are involved with it, and all the famous names who read it and liked it, and I just keep saying, "Okay, do something with it already."
Well, but what does it mean when something is optioned? Can you, for people who don't know the quote lingo of of Hollywood, what is an option and how does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question because I didn't know when they first optioned it what it meant. And what it meant was what it means is that they own the rights to the book. So they can do with it what they will for a certain period of time. They pay a certain amount of money. There's usually a renewal that is available after, I think in my case it was a year and a half. Then
Mhm.
they could re-up, and it was their option to re-up. So each person who's done it, and there have been about 4 different groups who've done it over,
'Cause every couple of years, the option runs out, and they have to decide if they're gonna keep.
and they get to decide whether they wanna redo it, and, every time they've redone it, so the book has been with individuals or groups for periods of 3, 4 years, then they drop out and say, "Okay, we gave it our shot, didn't happen." Somebody else comes along. The woman who has it now, who's working with my guy in LA, um, I think she read my book like 15 years ago,
Yeah.
remembered it, and was in the office of somebody's office, and my book came up, God knows how. And so she went, "Oh, that's available."
I want in. And but and you would think anybody who's into developing series for TV and or for streaming or anything, a book like this is tailor-made for that because the book is really a series of what I think 15 stories in the book. Each one stands alone, all told by this narrator, the locksmith, who is you. Um, and I'm going to talk more about the book itself, but I mean, you've given the first 15 episodes of a series right here because each one is its own show.
Well, it's interesting because one of the people who had it wanted to approach it that way. And my guess is that the people who have it now don't. My
Right.
my guess is it's gonna bear no resemblance to who I was when I wrote that book.
And you don't have any control over that once you give them the option, right?
I have no control of it. They may seek me out. I've written a follow-up book, which is unpublished, which I think personally has better material than that first one. Um,
Season two.
I mean, I don't know. They have to create an arc to the story. They have to
Right.
create who I am, who I'm gonna be. It's not gonna be me. It'll be something else. And that's fine. I don't care.
It certainly isn't James Gandolfini.
It certainly isn't. But that's okay. I remember when I first, right before the book got published, I got a phone call from a guy who wrote for the New York Times. And he had gotten my name from some agent who had read a novel of mine 7 years ago, 7 years before that,
Yeah.
and said, "I'm thinking about writing a piece about a locksmith. Would you be interested in talking to me?" And I went, "Sure, why not?" I was right in the middle, or maybe I had just finished the first draft of Keys. So he picked me up and we drove around New York from job to job, and he watched me work, and we talked a lot of like books, and we didn't talk a lot of locksmithing, but a lot of books, a lot of politics, a lot of, this and that. And then he wrote this unbelievable piece that appeared on what was then the Metro section of the New York Times,
Nice
called Doctor of the Deadbolt, which is how that phrase
term. Yeah, that they use
appeared.
in the book. Yeah.
And I started getting phone calls that morning, the day the paper came out, from like 6 in the morning to 9 at night. People who read this article in the New York Times. One guy got locked out of his apartment. He walked downstairs. The New York Times was on the stoop. He opens it up. There's this article about a locksmith. He looks me up in the then phone book, and he called um, to like a woman producer who was on vacation in the Rockies and wanted to option the book. I had no idea what an option was,
Right.
but I did get a phone call from a woman who was very cool, New York City kind of indie producer. And she and I met for dinner and created a story for who this guy was, who I was. Wasn't me, but it had elements. I still love the narrative that we created that night in the Cornelia Street Cafe, which will never see the light of day. You know, it won't resemble what ends up happening at all.
Well, they could call it a complete unknown.
Be great. I'm not
We got to go back now because, you mentioned that a friend of yours gave you the idea to start writing this down. But I remember visiting you when we were in college. You were at the University of Michigan. I spent a few days with you there, and you were surrounded with a group of friends that I had never met before, but they were your new friends from college who were very creative. You were in with this like creative group of people. Everybody was doing something, music or writing or art. And then you ended up in New York City. How did you become a locksmith? And how does that all tie into this group of friends who were part of this sort of creative entourage that you had?
Well, it's a good story, I think. I came to Michigan. I was kind of a jock, kind of a guy who was probably going to end up in law school, and met all these people who were like musicians and paint. And, one is an art school, and I'm going, oh, that's cool. I like that. And I started playing guitar to emulate my friend Howie, who played guitar.
The one who became the famous author in
And
France. Yeah.
author in France, and he became a professional clown, and he had an act that he toured the world with.
Yeah, didn't he go to, like, the Barnum and Bailey clown school or something?
Howie and I sat in his apartment sophomore year, and he said to me, I'm dropping out of college. I'm going to apply to Barnum and Bailey. Could you help me with the application?
Unbelievable.
And he sat there and wrote an exploding pickle gag, um, which seemed pretty stupid to me, but he sent it off. He got in. He went down to Sarasota. He did not get into Barnum and Bailey, which they said, according to him, that he was too unique. And he
Which means you'd play well in France.
Right. Uh, he uh, ended up joining what was called a mud show called the Circus Bartok and toured the East Coast of the US for about 3 years. Mud show because, they'd set up in a lot and there if it rained, the area would just become untenable. Uh, and
It's like a
so
bench.
how he ended up in that, he ended up in LA. He used to hang out at the Comedy Store doing this one-man show that he had called Buffo. Met all these comics who went on to become fame, Leno and Letterman and all these other guys that were out there.
Probably Larry David, I would think, because, it reminds me of Larry David.
Yeah, he never talked about him, but I'll bet you he met him.
Yeah.
So he ended up I ended up going to New York because I graduated in Michigan. I did stay. I graduated. I became an elementary school teacher for a year and a half, which is a sort of bizarre side turn I took, which I loved, but didn't agree with the principal on principles. Um, and I was playing guitar in bars around Detroit and Ypsilanti. And a friend of mine said, you write good songs. People who write good songs go to New York. And I went, oh, okay. So I went to New York and I I asked everybody I knew if they knew somebody. And a friend of a friend of a friend of my dad's
Wow.
knew a guy who supposedly was managing Phoebe Snow.
Oh, she was very big back then.
Yeah. And she had just done Poetry Man. And, we're talking 74, 75, something.
Yeah, like the early to mid '70s.
Yeah. And turned out what I didn't know was that Phoebe Snow had sued him and dropped him. But
So he's looking for a new Phoebe Snow to replace her.
He was looking for a new James Taylor,
Yeah.
and I had elements of that. I wasn't bad. I mean, I'd written some nice songs.
I remember when you were first learning the guitar and doing open tuning and stuff like that, and, that was, pretty cool.
Yeah, it was really fun, and I was not bad, and I learned fast. And I wrote some decent songs, and I sat in the guy's office, and he offered me a contract, which was sort of unheard of, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
And, so that was he gave me was probably the equivalent of an option, 6-month deal, try to get me a record deal, which he didn't do. And I pursued it from, like, '74 to '79. I got tired of dealing with all the drugs that were in the industry at that time,
Yeah.
enjoying interacting with those people, and, was broke, had no money. I wasn't gigging in New York like I had been in Michigan, and a friend of mine, um it's a crazy story. Okay, so a friend of mine had a cousin who had a lock business that was based on ads in the Yellow Pages. He had no store, and he would put an ad into the Yellow Pages in Brooklyn because he had DBA'd a locksmith in Staten Island,
Good.
and the ad in Brooklyn would say a locksmith, and then very, very small print at the bottom of the ad would be the address in Staten Island.
Staten Island,
He
yeah.
put a phone in an apartment in Brooklyn that would get forwarded to his apartment in Queens. Anyway, he was going borough to borough and building a business, and he wanted to expand into Manhattan.
He was kinda doing guerrilla marketing.
He was doing guerrilla marketing. And so he asked his cousin, "Hey, you know anybody who will let me put a phone in their apartment?" And, um, it's a little more complicated than just that, but that's how I met him. He offered my friend Kenny, who was one of my Michigan friends who had
One of the
went
artist friends, yeah.
art school in New York,
Yeah.
and he was working as a waiter, and he offered Kenny a job as a locksmith, and Kenny went, "Okay, I can probably make more money doing that as I can as a waiter." And Kenny was very good with tools. He did it for a couple months, and he said to me, I was working like as in a bank or something, and he said, "Joel, you have to do this with me. We will make money, and it's so much fun." And Kenny taught me how to do the rudiments, and I turned out I loved it, and I walked away from the music business and became a locksmith.
Didn't Howie wasn't he part of with the little group, then the locksmith group that you put together? Because when I saw him when I was visiting you once in New York, he said, "When you get this TV series made, I want to find out who's gonna play me. I'm the dispatcher," or something like that. He didn't do locksmithing, but he answered the phones or something.
Well, it's funny because Howie moved from LA to New York in like 1980 or 81 when he wrote a novel that got published in the States. It sold about 12 copies, and his agent sold it in France, where it sold over 1,000,000 copies. So
Incredible.
he ended up moving to France, but he was living in this little group we had on 30th Street in, Manhattan, and it was Howie and Kenny and me. Our friend Michael lived up the street. Gary lived next door. It was like, it was a little Seinfeldian group.
Exactly. That's what I remember is that you guys would, like, get together at the end of each day and swap stories.
We would go to the Market Diner on 33rd and 9th and talk to the characters there, some of whom I've written about, and just run it down. I I had a girlfriend at the time who was a folklorist, and she loved our stories so much. She would come to the diner and put her tape recorder in the middle of the table and say, "Okay, just ignore it. I'm just gonna take you. I'm gonna write about you."
I'm not here. I'm not here.
Right. So that's how it started, and how he ended up moving to France in, like, 83, 84. And Kenny and I worked together for 7 years with we made our own little business, did our own little advertising in the Yellow Pages, not to the extent and the way those guys we started working for did.
Well, isn't the trick like, doing Yellow Page ads is that you have to be first because people will call the first one that they see. So if there's an A locksmith, then there has to be an AA locksmith.
There were A, triple A, double, quadruple A's. The thing was, it was either first or last.
Uh,
So because people would page through the book, you know. Yeah, it's a time gone by that people don't remember much anymore. But that's how we started. And, you know, for every 100 jobs you did, you got one repeat, one client.
mm.
And Kenny worked with me till 86 when he won a Guggenheim, and he disappeared to Italy and said bye-bye. And I was on
In
my
other
own.
words, he was able to l- live through the trial years doing locksmithing and then become a successful artist, fine artist.
Yeah. And he's made a living as an artist his entire career, which is remarkable.
I went to a museum and saw an installation of his work there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, he's great. And he was great to work with. We had a lot of fun. We made money. We built the business a little bit. We were not so intent on building a business as simply getting by. But in 86, when he left, my ex-wife and I had our first child. And all of a sudden I needed some more money.
Yeah.
So I had to decide, okay, am I serious about this? And if I am, what does it look like? So I kept doing it, and I got a corporate client right around then, which changed my life because all of a sudden I was doing both yellow page jobs and real work.
Yeah.
Uh,
Like you had a sweetheart account.
I had a sweetheart account which grew, you know, I won't name the company,
Yeah.
but it grew exponentially from 86 until I stopped working for them like in 2012 or something. Uh, yeah.
So all this time it's paying the bills while you're a struggling artist. Like everyone in the arts, you have to find a side gig that pays the bills until your big break comes along.
Right, and for me, it became more than a side gig. It became my profession, but, you know, and I wrote through the '80s. I wrote fiction and stopped when I just didn't make it. And Howie would come back and forth from France to New York and spend his vacations with me in New York, riding around in my lock car, this his pad of paper, writing his novels or his little tiny little laptop thing, which
Yeah.
it was in those days a laptop thing. Um, and
And Howie, just we should stop on Howie for a second because for some of the listeners who are watching or listening to us now may didn't know of him, he became a big star in France as Buffo the Clown, right?
he was huge. He just passed away. He passed away a week ago, and I think there's actually going to be an obit in the New York Times about him.
Right.
It told me she got contacted about him. He was an author. He was a professional clown in the commedia dell'arte tradition of clowning, not in the Emmett Kelly tradition. And he was a psychologist who founded a center for autistic children outside of Paris. Triple threat, remarkable man.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I'll miss him.
Yeah, I remember he had I guess it was part of an institute in Paris or in France that was its own. I mean, it was its own thing, its own success, but it was all funded by the success of his work then as Buffon.
That's correct. It was funded by the French government. He used to think of himself, he told me this once. He worked with the really, really seriously autistic children. Those were his specialties. Called himself the Red Adair of the autistic world.
Redhead, yeah, he was the guy who put out oil rig fires, right?
Exactly. He would get a phone call. Somebody in the south of France knew about him and said, listen, could you just help me out? And he would go down there and work with these kids. I mean, you know, who knows what that um, world would think of Howie's efforts today, the kind of strategies he used. I don't know. He did write a book about working with autistic children, which got published here in the States, sold more copies than his novel, which made him famous in France. Um, but Howie would come back to New York, ride with me, talk with me. And at some point, and I actually wrote a story about him in this second unpublished book. At some point, he said to me, um, you got to write these up, like I mentioned previously.
Yeah.
And he talked to me about how to do it. And he kept nudging me. And that's what got me back into writing. And we're talking like you and I reconnected, I think, in 93, somewhere around there.
Yeah, because we were going off on our own journeys then, and every now and then we had a chance to, reconnect and catch.
Well, you called me and you were out in Santa Rosa and you called me and said, I heard you're in New York. I don't know where you heard it from, Steve or something.
Another mutual friend, yeah.
Yeah, and you said, I'm coming to New York because I just published this book. And I went, you published a book?
Right.
What's the book about?
The the la well, the last time we had seen each other before that, probably, I was in film school, and then I went off on kind of my spiritual journey, and, I dropped out, and I lost contact with a lot of folks except for a few like you.
Yeah, and you came to New York and I think I drove you around town and we went to little haunts, little restaurants.
Right.
You had them with her, I think, at one point. I'm not sure on that trip.
She came in on some of the trips, yeah, my wife.
And we reconnected. And so I had just started to write the lock stuff when that happened,
Mm.
which took a couple years to come to fruition.
Ah,
And I think,
yeah.
you know,
Well, I know on one of those trips, you were living in Brooklyn in Park Slope, in an apartment overlooking the park,
right.
and when the day I was visiting you, they happened to be doing Revolutionary War reenactment of the Battle of Park Slope right outside your window. This
Battle of
was
Long Island.
Battle of Long Island, where George Washington escaped from the Brits.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. That was kinda memorable for me because I'd never seen one of those before, and I thought, "This is so cool, it's right out your window."
It was right out the window. It was a little tiny park. It wasn't, Prospect Park. It was down the slope. Little tiny park where there was the old stone house
Uh-huh. Yeah.
where the Marylanders had held off the Brits long enough for Washington and get over to Manhattan and then get over to Jersey. Yeah.
Amazing, another near miss, yeah.
Yeah. But also, Peter, when the most memorable trip you made to New York for me was when you were in the James Beard contest.
Oh, yes, yes,
And we had a 24-inch snowstorm.
yes, you were integral for
Starter
your
You flew with your starter from California,
yeah.
called me up and said, "I'm gonna be baking my bread at Annie's," I think.
Amy's Bakery in Hell's Kitchen.
Yeah, and you said, "Any chance you could pick me up and drive me down to the James Beard house?" Meanwhile, there's, like, snowdrifts at 2 feet tall,
That's right, yeah.
and I got in the lock car, and I found my way over to 44th or 5th and 9th Avenue, and you had a big brown bag full of baguettes and
It's little we were these sourdough breads that we put in flour bags.
yeah,
Colin,
and
we did the trunk of your car.
and you climbed over the snowbanks, we put them in the car, drove down to the village, and you won the damn
And I
thing.
won the competition, which was like the big breakthrough. That from that came my big book, Bread Baker's Apprentice, was the result of winning that competition because the prize for winning. And you came to the James Beard House and got a chance to kind of like be part of that scene.
I
But
did.
I
Yeah,
got to go to France and meet some. As the prize was to go to France and get to interview famous bakers there, which ended up becoming my next book, which ended up winning the James Beard Award for best cookbook of the year. And
that was great.
it all started as a result of that adventure at the Beard House.
Yeah, and you went to Paris and were with Lionel Poilin um, and I have a picture of you at the Centre Pompidou Center,
That's right.
in front of that center with Howie, who
With
wants
Howie. That's where I met Howie for the first time.
yeah,
And,
my good
your
friend
other
Mike.
friend, Michael, yes, who's also like a screenwriter himself. Was he
Yeah,
part of your
screenwriter.
college group? Was he going back to college, or did you meet him in New York?
I met Michael in New York in like 76. We were both working at the Pace University bookstore. It was before I became a locksmith. I was writing songs and he ended up playing. We did gigs together like in Brooklyn and Sheepshead Bay. And
No kidding.
yeah. Yeah.
So both Michael and Howie ended up in France as expats, basically living in France and becoming very successful over there. It
Right.
seemed like Howie told me one time. He said, "People, when I write in English, people don't read anything I write, but when they translate it into French, it somehow works and everybody likes it."
He had a translator who was pretty famous over there, who you know who I believe often claimed credit for how he says,
Well,
but we won't go there on that one.
that's well, yeah, to be determined. But more importantly for me was this: is that you had this creative little colony, your own, art colony of struggling artists, all in different forms of arts, all trying to find their way, paying their way, doing whatever it took to get to the next day, and like, in the end, you were the last one with the locksmith. Everyone had moved out of the locksmith business, and you were holding the fort and making good money doing that. And then the book came out, and suddenly you were like, "Okay, I'm now got my piece of the art out there."
Yeah, and it's interesting. I thought about it a lot back then because I was the only one of the group who had what might be called a real job, and it pained me a lot because sometimes I felt like I was doing it the wrong way, even though I loved being a
Yeah.
locksmith
Yeah.
and I was good at it. Um, but it was always ironic to me that my success as a writer came about writing about my career as a locksmith, which I never ever wanted to do. But Howie helped find my
Yeah,
niche.
and you gotta write about what you know, and, like, Keys to the City is a book of stories. It happens to be about a locksmith, and that's what and you knew it intimately. We recently had a guest on Pizza Quest whose, father was a rug man, and his whole thing is he was like one of the last of a dying breed of rug installers and guys who could repair, old antique rugs and things like that, and he wrote a great novel about that because he knew it intimately. So I think what's cool is that the authenticity, it's not like you're a writer who came up with an idea. You were the guy that was living that story, and you told it, and that authenticity comes through, and I think is what part of what makes the book so good, and what makes it viable, not only as in its own right as a book, but, as potentially in other art forms. I mean, I could say Keys to the City, the musical.
Well, thank you for the kind words. I think that you're right. I think it came organically out of literally those nights sitting around where somebody would say, "So what'd you do today?" And the thing is that for me, it was not just telling what I did that day. It was trying to shape it way that people might say, "Oh, that's cool."
Yeah,
You know,
I could
I
see
like
the
the way you
around
said
the table, everybody had to be able to tell the story really well, so it was almost competitive, you got to be able to push each other to become a better storyteller.
yeah, I think that's what happened for me. And also, when I wrote that book, my business had taken off to the point where I didn't have a lot of spare time. And I found it easier to write small chunks. I used to, in between jobs, I would go to coffee shops and I would, take my notebook and I would start writing these stories because I found it easier to manage small pieces of time and then eventually piece them together into what was a story. And then late at night or early in the morning, I would redo them, sentence by sentence people kind of think like though. My worry was that that book was always going to be viewed as like a series of puff pieces, and that was my real fear, and that's why I worked at crafting them. And some people got that fact, when they actually reviewed the book. I was amazed the book actually got reviewed. It was great.
Well, as I've been rereading not only these stories, but some of the new ones that you're working on that haven't been published yet, and I wanna talk about how you've developed your writer's voice and what it is that you know, how you view the craft, and because there's something that makes the stories work that for me, I would put it's the number 1, you love your characters. You're writing about these quirky New York people who are based on real people, but there's an affection that you as the narrator have for them. So there's, some of the characters could be considered weird or good or eat bad or this and that, but you as the storyteller seem to have a genuine affection for these characters, and that seems to be what's driving it. And also there's kind of a wistfulness, almost a melancholy tone underneath it, a sense of longing, I call it, that is captured through these characters. So do you think about those things as you write your stories?
Absolutely do. I mean, it's really easy to go on. I mean, I don't do these kind of, I'm retired at the moment, so it's been a few years since I've done any jobs. But when I was at the height of doing those kinds of jobs, it would have been really easy to view some of these folks as creeps, you know?
Uh-huh.
But really, I mean, people are in tough situations when they call an emergency locksmith, and the worst can come out. Um, so I mean, one of the stories in the second book was about a couple that kept locking each other out over the course of an evening. Okay,
Right.
and um, and the book is really the story is really about marriage or partnership and how that plays out. But I couched it in terms of these two people who kept locking each other out, and they were both not very nice people. I mean, this all really happened, and I found myself liking both of them, understanding both of them, even though they were doing kind of terrible things to each other and lying to each other, and in the end, they bonded with each other against me.
Right. Because the one thing they had in common was you. So you're going to take the fall.
Right. So so I guess I use that as an example that yeah, I kind of I just like finding that side of people rather than the other side of people. Sometimes it can't be helped. Sometimes people are just so damn unappealing that there's no way to portray it otherwise.
But your job as a storyteller is to find the story within the story. The locksmith is kind of the MacGuffin that drives things forward, but there's always something deeper, underneath it that you're getting at. And I guess that's what I'm really asking is what is it that you feel like you're getting at? Because that's what Pizza Quest is all about is we're all getting at something. We're on and we don't always know what it is, but we're searching for something.
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, I think I don't think I did it super consciously. I think that it evolved as I was working on a story. Obviously, I wouldn't start working on a story unless there was something picaresque about it that warranted me putting it down on the page, you know. But I like showing people's vulnerabilities, even if they were doing it in an angry way.
Yeah.
Even if they were, like in one of the Keys to the City stories, there's a guy and his son, and the guy, older man, was Bugsy Siegel's doctor, supposedly.
Right. Right.
Was it true? He said it was. I believe. Um,
It works for me.
it worked for me, and he was just mean to his son, really
Yeah.
mean to his son, and his son was taking care of him, lovingly taking care of him. And so I guess what I tried to do was not make the old man, um, a horrible person, and to over the course of the story show the affection they each had for each other. While the old man was yelling at me like, what are you doing there? Why are you drilling it there?
There's kind of a Raymond Carver and maybe Flannery O'Connor, quality to these stories. Again, like you said, because not Flannery O'Connor was one of the great writers of short stories in the history of America, um, and her characters are not, on the surface, always good people, but she found the heart of the story, and in finding the heart of the story, she found the heart of, these characters. Um, do you have literary role models or heroes of your own that kind of have helped shape your style?
Well, Carver was somebody I was reading a lot of back then, no doubt about it.
'Cause and he's really a master of being able to say it in as few words as possible.
Yeah, and just tight, really tight sentences. He was not flowery at all. Um, I mean, I imagine he could expand out. I mean, like in the story Cathedral, I think he did that. But yeah, he was somebody I read a lot about. I'm trying to think who else I was reading back then. I read work in the 60s and 70s where I just liked the sentences. So I wanted to kinda combine the punch of oddball sentences, like, there was a book called The Horse's Mouth that I loved, The Ginger Man, I love.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
We're going way back now. J.P. Dunleavy.
Dunleavy. Yeah, yeah. I remember those. Yeah,
And I like those kinds of sentences that almost felt like they were, you know, coming from a direction you didn't expect.
yeah,
And I like combining that with the sort of pithiness that
yeah,
Carter did in the way he constructed stories. I mean, I ended up liking long form short stories like Alice Munro's stuff. I liked it a lot. Um, have to reevaluate now, I guess, but um, uh, it wasn't the way I wrote. That wasn't the way I wrote.
yeah,
Uh, so, you know, I would try to create that sort of like jab feeling in, in the stories.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And there is pithy is a good word because it really is being able to get to the heart of it quickly.
Yeah.
And short stories are really more suited to that approach, I think, than novels, long novels.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that story, The Naked City in Keys, so that story, it's an interesting story. So, it's about me on a sub-zero night, East Village, coming up to this fifth floor walk-up apartment where there's something wrong with the lock and the door opens and there's a naked ancient old man standing there. And, I fix the lock and get invited back for chocolate tort or whatever it was with these 5 other naked guys. And people would say to me, "Did that really happen?"
Yeah,
You know? And I would s and what was interesting was that I made up a few little things in the story in order to push it forward, that could have been true or might not have been exactly true. And always the thing that they said, "Did that really happen?" happened. And the things they said, "I loved what you did there." I might stretch the truth.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But that's the craft. You're telling the story, and that has to take precedence of tell the story.
It is a story after all.
And the book itself is not promising to be, a memoir of Joel Kostman. It's this being told by a nameless locksmith who's telling the stories.
Right,
Uh,
whereas the second book I worked on is more like a memoir of Joel Kostman with lock stories wrapped into it.
well, uh, well, we'll see what happens when they option that one and what they do to that Joel Kostman.
Every finger is crossed.
Well, this is Pizza Quest after all, and you and I have had a couple of memorable Pizza Quests together. I mean, as my New York go-to guy, you had this great locksmith car, which was all dinged up. It was like when Susan got in it the first time, she couldn't believe that this was your car, but she never stops telling people that she loved that car because I think you told her it's so banged up that nobody would ever try to break in and steal my tools.
That's exactly why I bought them that way.
That's right. And so you took me, aside from taking me to the James Beard House for that competition, we had that adventure. But then later on, I started working on the pizza book, and we went on two places together, separate times. One was Roberta's, which at the time had just opened. It was just
Just so.
up and running, and we could barely find it in Bushwick. Bushwick is now this super hot neighborhood, but back then you knew the whole city, and you had hardly even ever been to Bushwick.
Didn't know the street that it was on. Yeah.
Yeah, so we drove by it 3 times before we actually found it, and we had and the cool thing about that, other than the fact that, we were having fun looking for perfect pizzas, was that they have now become legendary. Now it's like it's only 15 years later, and they're this legendary, landmark in the
Right.
pizza world. But the
Right.
other one that we went on, and I thought we had the most fun on, was going to what was then the legendary DeFara's Pizza in Brooklyn. And we had to take a very well-known food writer named Jeffrey Steingarten with us.
Yeah.
And Jeffrey is, one of my favorite food writers, and he and I had cooked up this idea of going to DeFara's to find out if it was as good as everybody said, because people were making pilgrimages to meet Dominic Dom DeMarco, the, 90-year-old or whatever he was at the time, pizzaiolo of DeFara's. And so you came and we drove us and got us there.
Well, I remember you said, "How do we get there? It's not an easy place to get to by subway." And so I said, "Look, I'll just take you."
Yeah, no, nice. Yeah.
I don't remember you were staying somewhere, I picked you up, and then we drove into Midtown or Chelsea or wherever Jeffrey lived,
Yeah.
picked him up, I kind of remember the look on his face when he got in the car.
In the car. Yeah. Like what? He's used to getting picked up by limos.
Yeah. Hey, oh, come on, and just enjoy yourself.
Well, I figure as a writer, he would appreciate the the uniqueness of that drive.
Well, and I think you told him a little bit about me, and so it's
And the
it
book had
paid.
come out by then, Keys had come out, so you were
Yeah,
so now you had that credibility, you're a published author.
right. Also, I'm an author.
Yeah, right. Oh, okay, then you're okay.
Then
Um,
you're
but
okay.
but what I remember about that trip was that none of us were blown away by the pizza that day.
Well, I think I liked it the most. Um, but if I may say, I mean, it was like the kind of pizza where if you held it, it wouldn't stand up to being held. And you said, "Well, yeah, this is the kind of pizza. Just reheat it once, and it'll stand up better to that." And Jeffrey was not impressed.
'Cause he was totally a crust guy,
Yeah.
and he wasn't and the crust let him down, and in the ride home, I remember we were talking about that, and I said, "Yeah, but that the sauce was quite good, better than the typical pizzeria sauce, and everything else about it was nice," and he says, "Yeah, but I can't get past that crust,"
Right.
and that it was much later, a year or 2, maybe a couple years later, when I was telling somebody about that, when I found out about the what he said, "Why did you have them throw it back in the oven and reheat it? That's the secret to DeVar's Pizza, you gotta do the rebake." And we didn't know that. Nobody had told us that. Don't never buy the whole pie. Just go in and buy a couple slices and tell them to rebake it. And then you get the crust experience that you were looking for. But we didn't know that at the time. So that was kind of
Yeah,
an interesting lesson.
imagine trying to tell Dominic, "Could you just reheat this?"
It's yeah, it's not as good as it should be.
I remember his kids came out from the back with something with a pie or with a box or something, and he gave them a look like, "Come on, okay, just give it to me, go away."
Yeah. Yeah, and we loved it because he would have his little basil plants there, and he would snip the basil right over your pizza
Scissor.
from the plant from the live plant, yeah, and so it was but those were the kind of, fun things that I we were had, like, these parallel tracks going. You were still doing locksmithing, collecting more stories to write about, more people, and
Yeah,
we were doing the same thing with the pizza. So,
yeah.
I was so glad that we had a chance to overlap, and every once in a while when I'd be with you, then Howie would be in from France, and we would all go out and eat, and I had a chance to experience briefly what you guys must have experienced every day when you would get together at the end of the day and swap stories because we could sit there and
Did
swap.
we ever go in New York, there's Ray's Pizza, and there's about 1,000 different Ray's pizzas.
Yeah.
500 of them are the original Ray's
Yes,
pizzas.
you're right,
Uh,
right.
and Hallie and I used to go to a Ray's Pizza on Prince Street, which I don't believe is there anymore.
You told me about that. You were the one who's that's the one we should go to, I think.
Did we never went there
I
together?
think I think we did go there on one of the trips, yeah, because I was still collecting, like, I was still hunting for, the best of the best or be able to tell the story
Right.
about Ray's was an integral part of the story at that time.
I I love that pizzeria. It was a little tiny hole in the wall. They actually expanded next door at one point, would had a few tables. They had 2 pictures on the wall in the small original pizza place. One was Joe DiMaggio
Yeah.
and the other was Joey Heatherton. And Joey Heatherton had this, like,
One of my childhood crushes, I have to say.
of our age, everybody had a Joey Heatherton. Yeah, she had a little flip of blonde hair over.
Yeah, right.
I just thought the juxtaposition of those 2, I guess they couldn't get a good picture of Marilyn Monroe to put in.
Well, they have the 2 Joes. They had Joe and Joey.
But Joey made me, what's that?
I think that yeah, I think I might have even written about that in American Pie, my first, pizza book. I think maybe included you in the narrative of saying there's only one there's if you're gonna go to the Rays, there's only one Rays that you should go to, and it's the one on Prince Street.
Didn't we sit in my living room and watch a movie that somebody you knew made about the Ray's Pizza saga?
That's right. The real story. I forget what it was called. Yeah, we did watch a Rays documentary.
A Ray's documentary. But I don't think the one that I liked was even in it. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Well, that's it. Well, it's been fun kind of interacting and overlapping our journeys but maybe we should are there any updates on how close you think it is to be able after 20 years of optioning and being let down and being on this roller coaster ride of of possibly seeing the light of day of a series based on this? Because I want people who are listening to this podcast to know, wait a second, I heard about it here first, because I think it's going to happen. I'm convinced it has to happen. It's too good of an idea not to.
Yeah, you and a lot of other people feel that way. I'm at the point where it's become so surreal that it's like waking up from a dream and then having the elements of the dream actually happen during your day.
Yeah.
The people who have it right now are very optimistic. They have a team together. They have a producer. They have a writer. They have an actor. Uh, and supposedly they're going out to streamers as we speak. I don't know how true that is, but I guess I'm as optimistic as I've been in 15 years when it was back at HBO.
Yeah.
And I I can't measure my skepticism. Because it's just taken too long.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, the good news for me is that if it happens, I'll probably get my book republished. I might even be able to sell that second unpublished book and maybe write a New Yorker article about how this 25-year saga has.
I think that's definitely a story that needs to be told, and that, it's standalone right there.
It is
And
a st
and then hopefully, as if time permits, to be able to tell the story of this great group of friends that you had, your circle in New York, where so much creative ferment took place that allowed each of you to spin off into your own, successful orbits,
Yeah.
and fully express your art.
Yeah, I'll just throw one little addendum on here. In 19, I don't know, 99 maybe, I was on All Things Considered, and I was interviewed by Robert Siegel. Um, he's an old New Yorker, and he must have read my book and liked it and took me on the show. It's the first time my publisher ever had a writer on All Things
Oh,
Considered.
cool. Yeah, yeah.
They wanted to hire a coach for me. Here's how you
Media
here's
a media coach.
Yeah. I went, "Get out of here. I'm not doing it." And after the interview, I came out and the person who worked for the publishing company looked at me and went, "You were great." Like, so surprised.
These
In any event,
there were no
each exactly. 3 weeks later, Kenny, my old lock partner, my old friend from Michigan, appeared on All Things Considered, interviewed by Robert Siegel for a show I think he had at the Corcoran at that point. So it was like the locksmith guys parlay, on
Yeah, really. Wow, it all comes home to roost. Wow.
it was amazing. Yeah.
Well, it's a lot of stories already told and still to be told,
Mhm.
and congratulations, and, it's so cool to be able every once in a while to reconnect, and, catch up a little bit,
Yes,
and then
I agree.
and I'm so honored that we've had a chance to be kind of running parallel journeys together, and overlapping them every now and then.
Well, I'm thrilled that we reconnected when we did 35 years ago, and I'm thrilled at everything that's happened for you. I just love watching you and your career.
Well, we always say on, one of our catchphrases on Pizza Quest is, "It's more about the quest than it is about the pizza, and the quest never ends." And I think that, is even as the years go by, as long as we still have a little bit of tread on the tires, I think, we still have stories to tell, and more quests to go on. So look forward to doing some more of those with you. I know you're now living in Chicago. You're no longer a New Yorker. How do you like Chicago?
I like Chicago a lot. I miss New York more.
Yeah.
Um, uh, yeah, the pizza here is every once in a while, some place pops up here on the 100 best pizzas in the country, and I go, "Yeah."
And it's hard for New Yorkers to get their head around the fact that Chicago it can play equal fiddle.
Yeah, well, we have a wonderful, Neapolitan pizza place around the corner from where I live called Spaccanapoli, which is just phenomenal.
Sure, and we've had Jonathan on Pizza Quest. We love Spaccanapoli, yeah.
Yeah, I know that, and, but there are pizza places popping up here where they make what they call a New York slice, and I'm trying them one by one. Yeah, getting close.
The quest never ends.
Clay.
Well, okay, how about we get you out on one final question? Um, over the course of this journey that you've been on, what do you think what have you learned about yourself through your writing? When you go back to read your writing, is there something that you could say as a takeaway is that you've learned something about yourself that, made it all worthwhile and helps sum up where you are at this moment in time?
Well, Winston Churchill once gave a speech which consisted of the words, never give up, never give up, never give up. And
Jim Valvano also made that that quote.
I take it to heart. I think, I started writing stuff that wasn't the norm, even when I was writing novels back in the early 80s. Um, one of which came very close. And I think what I've learned is don't stay true to whatever it is that's guiding guiding the words that come out of you, guiding the stories you want to tell, and not tailoring them to what you think the masses might want.
Mhm.
And for me, I was always kind of amazed that I was capable of this. I was amazed back when I did music that I was capable of that. So it's kind of like maintaining that, dare I say it, humility about what you do. Um, and at the same time, striving to really be good.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think that's what I've tried to do. And I hope I'm doing it to a certain extent.
Well, we always say that, pizza the other catchphrase for Pizza Quest is a journey of self-discovery through pizza. And
Mhm.
I expand that metaphor to be through whatever art that you're expressing. And so so it seems like, that's the part that never ends, the journey of self-discovery, and it seems like you're still fully immersed in it.
I'm not going to give it up.
Great. Well, don't. And when as the story continues to unfold, as new developments come, we'll try to get you back on, and you can give us some updates from time to time of how it's going.
God willing, if the creek don't
There you
rise.
go. Joel Kostman, thanks so much for great to see you again. Thanks for coming on, folks. Keys to the City, it's still available through Amazon and other arcane bookstores that carry this book's I've been out almost 30 years now, and it's still selling. It has a cult following, and uh, and it's worth the read. It's the great stories, and we'll look forward to more of them. Joel, thanks so much. I'm
Thank
glad
you,
you
Peter. Thanks for inviting me on. I appreciate it.